So now let's look at fractions of shapes. Now this is going to be really easy, but I want to instill early on, I want to get students away from being afraid of fractions early on. All right, that's why I'm so glad that we're looking at halves and fourths right now, because I want students to have a good, solid chance at not being fraction phobic when they grow up. Fractions are one of the most sort of almost traumatic topics that a lot of students have a really hard time with. And I think that's because there's a mystique around them, because they didn't exist for a long period of time, and suddenly you have to deal with these fractions and you have to deal with common denominators and a bunch of nonsense like that. If we, again, lay a foundation, build some framework, then maybe when we start actually manipulating fractions later on in 4th and 5th grade, students won't be so afraid because they will have already had a basic idea and intuition of what these fractions actually mean. So let's go into halves. Is this circle cut into halves? Yes, it is. Which picture divides the square in half? Well, A isn't right. It cuts it into 3 pieces. B cuts it into 2 pieces, but they are not the same. C cuts it into 2 pieces. I was expecting it to cut up and down, but either way, this is cut in half. And that's important. It's important to let students know that a square, hey look, I can cut a square in half up and down. I can cut a square in half left and right. I can even cut a square in half on the diagonal. Hey, what other shapes can you cut into halves, and in how many different ways? Look at different rectangles, look at different triangles, and look at how many different ways you can cut it in half. Again, you're playing, but it is going to be laying, again, very important foundations going forward. Is this square divided into halves? No. Looks like thirds to me. This picture cuts it in half, B cuts it into thirds, and that's halves. So now we're going to go from the halves to the have-nots. Huh? All right, here we go with fourths. Or quarters. Quarters is another good word for it. A is clearly wrong. B is cut into halves, so that's not right. C is cut into halves, so that's not right. D is cut into quarters, which if you can get across the idea that the quarters are just cutting each half in half, then you are in a great place. Like, notice how in both of these, A or B and C, if we were to layer B and C on top of each other, right? If we were to take B and C and combine them, we would end up with D. So knowing that cutting into fourths or quarters is the same thing as cutting in half and then cutting in half again is another very important idea to get going as soon as possible. So it's divided into 4, but it's not divided into fourths because they would have to be equal. And this bottom and top part are clearly smaller than these middle 2 parts. Which one divides it into quarters? Now B is close. B is so close. In fact, I'm going to zoom way in on B. Look at how close that is to being cut into quarters. This is a mean problem, because I could absolutely see myself clicking on that and moving on. But you'll notice that this line here is not quite a straight line. These two are almost certainly quarters, but this sector here is slightly less than a quarter. This sector here is slightly more than a quarter. You gotta be on your toes. D here is cut into quarters. Always look at all the answers before you choose one, because you might fall for a trap otherwise. That rectangle does look like it's divided into fourths to me, once downward and once horizontally. And that's fourths. We are almost done, my friends. We are 80% of the way through this. We're going to take quiz 2, which is going to be on measurement, data, and geometry. Is that divided in half? Yes, it is. And let's look at this. How many different ways can I divide this rectangle in half? I can see up, down. I can see left, right. I can see 2 different diagonals. So I would say there are 4 different ways that I could cut this in half. So Daedric mentions doing first grade quantum physics, and that's a joke, but I do plan on going into physics curriculum on this as well, including grade school science. So it's entirely possible that I will do just that, Fire Lord Daedric. The time is 6:30, right? It's in between the 6 and the 7, which means it's always 6 until it hits 7, and the big hand is halfway across. Half of 60 minutes is 30 minutes. That's not a square. That looks like a square. That's not a square, that's a triangle. I don't know what that is. It looks like someone took a bite out of a square. Which one is cut into fourths? Pretty clearly D. Which one is a trapezoid? Again, like a rectangle with two different bases. And that's quiz 2.